Hello, and welcome to Clearer Thinking with Spencer Greenberg, the podcast about ideas that matter. I'm Josh Castle, the producer of the podcast, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. In this episode, we collected all the public cases we could easily find where someone had given Spencer extensive criticism, and I picked out several that I thought were the most interesting, and I asked Spencer about them.
Josh, thanks for joining me on this special episode.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So today we're going to do something very unusual. We've gathered up instances where people have said that I'm wrong or have disagreed with me or made critiques of things I've said and put them in a big spreadsheet, and you've reviewed them. And today we're going to go through them. Obviously, we're not going to be able to cover every critique that people have given me. You got to pick the ones that you thought were most interesting, and we'll go through them. And for each, I'll attempt to steelman the case for the critique. In other words, I'll attempt to make the strongest argument that I can for the argument against my position. And then once I've done that, you can feel free to comment or jump in if you have anything you want to add or say. And then I will say what I actually think now, having reflected on the steelman of their position as well as their original critique. I'll give my point of view.
Sounds good. So
what's the first critique of things I've said that we're going to do?
So some people have critiqued your views about cults. First of all, I guess I should ask, are you anti-cult?
I am anti-cult, but I will clarify that not everyone uses the term cult the same way. So I may not be anti-cult according to someone else's definition of cult.
And how would you define cult?
Well, first of all, I think of cults as being on a spectrum. And I just do not think you can apply binary to cults. Like, yes, there are some things that are so far on the spectrum that like any reasonable definition would call it a cult. But I think we have to accept that what we're talking about is a number of related, kind of correlated properties that a group can have. And you can have more of them or less of them. And then we can talk about what are those properties. And I would say that the kind of most key characteristic properties have to do with a group that has one or sometimes two or a small group of leaders. Those leaders, sometimes the cult will continue existing after those leaders are dead, but at least there has to be initial leaders that are thought of as having special information or special knowledge or special abilities. The group separates itself from society through its ideas and sometimes physically. The group typically discourages outside information seeking and becomes its own kind of information ecosystem. The group requires self-sacrifice of its members, and the group members sacrifice for the benefit of the group, but much of this benefit often accrues to not the group itself, but to the leader, although some of the benefit might also go to the group itself. And the group also typically has high levels of conformity that are demanded, whether it's in conformity of ideas or conformity of dress or conformity of behavior. And finally, typically, group members will be asked to behave in ways that are generally considered unethical in some manner, or group leaders will behave in a way that's generally considered unethical. So that's kind of how I think about it. And again, it's a spectrum concept. But if you take a group like the People's Temple that was run by Jim Jones, like that was very clearly a cult. They like ticks every single box. And then you have things that are like much less clear. Like you might have like a multi-level marketing group, and maybe that might be 60% of the way to a cult, but not actually fully 100% a cult.
So one of the critiques or disagreements from listeners is the idea that there's such a thing as a good cult. Like, from the way you're describing it, it sounds like maybe you generally think that most cults or maybe all cults are bad, and the disagreement is the belief that some cults are good. One listener said, cults are an essential part of the genius of America. Cults have tremendous potential to address the deep problems of modernity, like obesity, addiction, loneliness, fertility collapse, etc. What do you think of that critique? Is there such a thing as a good cult?
Yeah, so to steelman it, I could see a few different reasons you might think that cults could be good. One thing is you might think they can create a really strong group identity, which while it could have some harms, you could say, well, maybe that's really nice to be part of a really tight-knit community, people that think similarly to you. Cults give people a mission a lot of times, which could be nice. And, if that mission's a good mission, it could be beneficial to the world potentially. Some cultiness might get people to do things that like work together really well, take on ambitious goals, maybe create things together. And also people may just enjoy being part of cults. Like they may find that it's an exciting thing to be part of. It gives them a lot of companionship, gives them meaning in their life, and so on, right? So I could see the cases made for some of those things. But and this part might partly be definitional, right? I don't know exactly what definition of cult this person wants to use. But what I would say is that a lot of those benefits are really about a tight-knit community. And so I would like to separate cults from tight-knit community. And yes, cults are tight-knit communities, but most of the good things I would put in tight-knit communities that have especially ones that have a shared sense of meaning and values, and separate that from cults, which is a very specific type of tight-knit community that has these things like separation from the outside world, conformity, self-sacrifice that ends up accruing to one or a small number of leaders who benefit a great deal from the self-sacrifice while the members in the group pay a price for it, and where unethical behavior is typically inculcated either among the members or among the leaders.
As you were reading your first definition of cult and the properties that many cults have, I was thinking of governance in general, and there seems to be maybe some similarities between cults generally and governments generally. It makes me wonder if that's true, if cults are a kind of governance mechanism. It seems like there could be potentially good cases. For example, often businesses, unicorn startups, are often referred to as cults if they have like a very charismatic leader and very like strong cultural identity within the company and have to adhere to very strict guidelines and things like that. But a lot of people will praise that if they are outputting a good product or if they have a good business model. So if that's true, if cults are a kind of governance structure, then does that make them morally neutral, or do they inherently have something sort of corrupt about them?
When I think of the word cult, I think of it picking out a pattern of the way things are structured. And, if we look across history, we see this pattern arise again and again and again. And if you think about companies, most companies are not very cult-like, right? Like the behaviors in the group are not that unusual. Like, okay, maybe people wear, business casual, but like, okay, so do, thousands of other companies, right? Like they don't behave that unusually from other companies. They don't, there might be some conformity like among people at the company, but it usually is not such an extreme conformity. Like they might conform around agreeing to proposals, but they're not usually conforming around every element of their life, right? Usually they don't have significant levels of isolation. Like the company is not telling them to like isolate from friends and family or to not seek information sources outside the company itself, right? And most companies don't ask people specifically to engage in unethical behavior, although obviously some companies do, and that's a problem in itself. And you might say sacrifice is maybe the more common element that companies might share with cults. Like some companies do ask for significant sacrifices in time, and some companies ask you to work really, really hard, but they also pay you for it, and you also can quit and get another job elsewhere. And so that is quite different still, where very often at cults, like members are asked to have tremendous sacrifices and don't even get paid for it, or get paid the absolute minimum, like in just food and a tiny bit of spending money, right? So yeah, so I'm not saying there aren't any companies that are cult-like. There are, but like most companies are not very cult-like. Okay, let's talk about more cult-like companies. Often people would say like Apple is a cult, right? Apple computer. Well, I think if you go through these things, you actually see it's only a bit cult-like. I think what makes it cult-like is people's dedication to it. Like people get really excited about it. They want to be part of it. They kind of attribute all these great properties to its leader and it. And, Steve Jobs was a charismatic leader. But still, I think most of these traits don't apply even to something like Apple, which is one of the more cult-like startups. On the question of countries, that's an interesting one, because actually I think there truly are cult-like countries. And I'm sure cult-like startups exist too. I just think they're really rare that are like really cult-like. But if you think about countries, I mean, North Korea is incredibly cult-like. I would argue that North Korea, in fact, is a cult. It's one of the largest cults in the world. If you look at the indoctrination of the people and what they teach the people about the leader, the extreme efforts they go to prevent people from having external information, the way that they commit extremely unethical acts against their own people, like locking people up for really minor things and making people, inform on each other and that kind of thing, and getting people to engage in extreme conformity as well. So I actually think North Korea is genuinely a cult. It's not a metaphor.
So one group of critiques that was really interesting to me and I thought would be interesting to discuss on the show, especially, are related to clearer thinking's mission, clearer thinking's tools, and things like that. Clearer thinking makes a lot of like rationality and self-improvement tools. And one of the critiques, or one group of critiques, is that basically these are mostly meaningless. Like maybe they're interesting to like go through and learn little things about yourself or others, but like they aren't the sort of thing that are going to move the needle in anybody's life in any real way. One critique from a listener was that they would probably focus on other kinds of things in somebody's life, like their physiological needs, eating the right foods, getting the right amount of sleep and exercise and things like that, before they would focus on their personality or psychology, things like that. Other critiques are that, these tools leave out some of the things that give people real meaning, like religion and spirituality. Yeah, so what's the steel man of those critiques?
Yeah, so I take it to be saying, look, do your tools really help people? You're focused on these really abstract things like how to think more clearly, how to make better decisions, how to have nuanced thinking. What really matters to people are not these kind of abstractions. What really matters are things like healthy eating or spirituality. And like these are the things that actually change people's lives for real. And I certainly agree that those things are really important, like, eating healthily, that really matters. And, people's religion or spirituality is some of the most important things to them, people who resonate with that. And I think there are lots of useful things to teach that we don't teach. I think that's absolutely true. There's tons of useful things you could teach. And maybe to steel man further, there is a lot of abstract material that probably doesn't change people's lives, right? You learn about a concept and then you never use it. I think that's like a very standard thing that happens. Or you just have trouble connecting that abstract concept to your daily life, so you don't even know how to apply it. Or maybe the information is just not that useful, right? Like, we have all kinds of tools on our website. I don't think every one of them is that useful. I think, obviously we try to make stuff that's useful, but I don't think we always succeed. So what do I think about this? I do think it's really hard to change people's lives. I think it's a big challenge. And I do completely agree that some of the things that the people who gave these critiques mention are important things. Why do I think what we teach is important? Well, let's go through a few of the things we teach. One of them is critical thinking, including things like nuanced thinking, like seeing the world probabilistically rather than true-false binaries, seeing things as in what we call gray thinking, like thinking of things as having both good traits and bad traits rather than seeing it as all good or all bad, like nuclear power is good or nuclear power is bad, like thinking about, well, what are the benefits and weaknesses of nuclear power, right? And comparing that to the benefits and weaknesses of other things. So that kind of material we teach. The reason I think it's important on a personal level is because I think that the better you understand the way the world works, the better you can make decisions about the world. Like if you have false beliefs about the world, that actually does impair your decision making, because now when you're trying to navigate the world, you actually just believe false things. And really clear-cut cases of this are things like around health, for example, which one of the critiquers brought up. But take health, right? Like, how do you know what to believe about health? You've got all kinds of podcasts saying all kinds of things that are completely contradictory. One popular health guru says you've got to just eat meat, and you have another who says, no, you've got to go vegan. And you have a third that says neither of those things matter. Actually, you just need to take these supplements, and that's the key to longevity and et cetera, right? So I think critical thinking is essential for making these like actually important life choices. It also affects society, right? Because we make decisions on behalf of society by voting, if we run an organization, we might be influencing society, or just even the way we impact other people in our lives. And I think critical thinking actually helps with that too. It helps leaders make better decisions. It helps people vote better. So I think it has societal implications as well. I also think sometimes falling into false beliefs can be just incredibly detrimental, whether it's certain conspiracy theories or it's false beliefs about the way the world works, where we think, for example, that one ideology has the answer to everything. And then when we start to think that, we start to rely on that ideology to answer all the questions of our life. That often goes really horribly because, in fact, no simple ideology has all the answers, right? So benefit the individual level for deeply understanding critical thinking. Now, it's a hard topic to teach. We try to teach it really well, but of course, it's an ongoing thing. We're learning to do it better and better over the years. I think our modules today are better than the ones, 5 years ago. And hopefully the ones 5 years from now will be much better still. So, it's still ongoing learnings about how do you best teach these things? How do you make it relevant to life? How do you help people apply it in everyday situations? and teach it in a way that it sticks. So that's some of the kind of material we teach. Other material we teach, I think, is actually, it's almost easier to make the case for it being beneficial. Like, we have a module on how to form healthy habits, and we actually ran a randomized control trial testing the exact interventions we teach in that module and showing that they actually do indeed work compared to the control group. The people that used our module had stickier habits over the coming weeks. And I think that's just a direct benefit, because I think healthy habits can, just make your life better. So that one's a relatively easier one. Or, material and goal setting. I think if you think about some of our content, it's trying to teach you to understand your values better so you can set goals better, or it's trying to teach you to think about how to set goals more effectively so you can get better at achieving the things you want. And so that has a really direct benefit. So I think it's a reasonable critique, but we definitely not say we're, doing perfectly at it. But I do think that the kind of stuff we teach has a lot of value. And I also think that I expect we'll continue getting better at it.
So let's assume for the moment that all the tools we have are really effective and useful and interesting. Why is the strategy of putting them up for free on our website better or more effective than, for example, trying to take them directly to, let's say, politicians or school boards or things like that to try to work them into educational decision-making, political decision-making, things like that more directly?
Right. So if you're thinking about making educational content to try to improve the world, I would say there's sort of three broad strategies that folks take. One is you try to go mass market, for usually focusing on adults, trying to reach as many people as you can. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to reach, we're not trying to reach literally everyone in the world, but we're trying to reach people who are in the top, let's say, 25% of reflectivity and interest in understanding themselves in their own mind and making better decisions on these kinds of topics. And we're trying to reach them with our content. The second strategy is you could go to kids and children, try to educate them, get them early, and hopefully have change the trajectory of their lives. And the third category is you could focus on people who have higher levels of influence. So whether it's focusing on politicians or focusing on business leaders or whatever, with the idea that even if you reach many fewer of them, maybe you can have an outsized impact because each of them affects a lot of other people, right? And I think those are all completely viable strategies that some people can do. And each of them, I think, could be great. I think we are best suited to do the broad-based adult strategy. I think it's the best fit for our skill set and our team. But I would not at all knock the other strategies. They could be great in other contexts. I just think we're not as well suited based on our own expertise and skill sets to address those other markets. For example, we don't have expertise in pedagogy for children, which I think is, not the same thing as pedagogy for adults. And we also don't have deep ties to politicians, for example. If you want to do a strategy where you're trying to influence politicians, you would want that ideally to be something you have a background in or you have deep connections in, etc.
Another kind of critique made by a listener is that the clear thinking tools and the studies behind them don't go through any kind of academic peer review process. So, we may do our own, quote, studies, but how legitimate are they really? How can people using the tools know how legitimate they are if we didn't, have them published in a major journal or have them reviewed by well-known academics, etc.?
Yeah, so to steel man this critique, I do think that peer review catches some forms of bad work and prevents it from getting out. Of course, someone could always submit to other journals and keep going from journal to journal until someone publishes. But at least if you're focused on sort of higher tier journals, yes, peer review catches some serious issues. It blocks some really low quality papers from getting into the literature, which I think is a good thing. Also, I'll add that sometimes peer review just makes papers better. So even if it doesn't block a bad paper, it could just make a mediocre paper better because the reviewers have really great comments, really great suggestions. They ask for more rigorous work and so on. So I think that to me, that's the kind of steel man of the case. And that by not using peer review, we're missing out on those benefits. We might be producing really shit work. And maybe if we went through peer review, we would, they would catch that it was shit, right? Maybe they would just suggest ways to make it better. Anything you'd add to that?
No, I think that summarizes it.
Okay, so what I think about this is actually reflected in an article we put out about the strengths and weaknesses of peer review. We talked about this a bit, but I'll kind of go over my thoughts now for those that didn't read that article. But first, I just want to say we do sometimes publish in peer-reviewed journals. In fact, just recently, we've published 2 papers in peer-reviewed journals. So this is something we do sometimes. We don't do it with most of our work, but we do it with some of our work. So why is that? Why don't we just try to put everything we do through peer review. First of all, some of our work, it just isn't relevant for peer review. So if we're making an interactive module trying to teach a concept, it's just not the sort of thing peer review exists for. So that doesn't really apply. But when we conduct studies, many of them would be appropriate for peer review journals in the sense that there exist peer review journals that we could submit to. My experience, having published a bunch of papers, is that I very rarely feel that my papers are better off having gone through peer review. Oftentimes, reviewers will have some minor helpful comments like, oh yeah, that would be a little bit better. I'll tweak this, tweak that. I have not had an experience where I felt like in any of my experiences with peer review, I've not had an experience where I felt like they found some devastating problem or they made some huge difference in the quality of our work. So I found it kind of marginally useful. That's not to say that it never happens. I think it certainly does sometimes happen, right? I do think the peer review blocks some really low quality work. I do think occasionally peer reviewers find some devastating critique or make something much, much better with their suggestions. I just haven't had that experience in my life. So additionally, I will say that I think peer review just doesn't work nearly as well as a lot of people think. Like I think actually it lets in a tremendous amount of bad work. And in fact, with our project, Transparent Replications, we go replicate random papers from top journals in psychology. And we only do the very top journals. And we find lots of very serious problems in those papers that clearly peer review is not catching. So I think people that believe in peer review, like I'm not saying they're wrong to think it's a good idea. I think it has a lot of benefits, but I think that they're really wrong if they think that it's a very effective method of weeding out bad stuff. I also find that we get lots of feedback on our work. When we put our work out in the world, we generally will get a lot of comments on it, a lot of suggestions, and a lot of critiques, kind of some of the things we're addressing in this episode. And I find that incredibly valuable. Now, I have to say, a lot of times I don't agree with those critiques, but I try to take them seriously. And we definitely learn from them. And there have been significant critiques people have given us that have been really helpful to us and helped us make our work better. And so we actually get critiques a lot. It's not by 3 academics in the field, as would happen with peer review, but it is by usually a lot more than 3 people, depending on the case, with a wide variety of different backgrounds, some of whom probably are experts in the topic, although many of whom are not. So I do find feedback incredibly, incredibly valuable. And I think our work would be much worse if we didn't get regular feedback and critiques. And so I do think critiques are really important. I just don't think they have to come from peer review. Now, why does peer review miss a lot of bad work? It's an interesting question. You may not agree with me. Maybe you think that it does a really good job. Well, I would just point you to the replication crisis in psychology, where I think, 15 years ago, I think about 40% of papers in top journals wouldn't even replicate. So if you tried to redo the experiment from scratch, you wouldn't even get the same answer. And I think that right there shows that peer review is missing a lot. But I think it's more than that. I think peer reviewers generally are not paid, so they're volunteer. They're generally anonymous. So it creates a very weird incentive structure where they generally don't have that much time to work on the peer review. They don't really have that much benefit from doing a really great job, although some of them do a really great job. It's a pretty thankless task. And they generally don't reanalyze the data. They generally certainly don't redo the study. I mean, it would just be way too much work. And so I think it actually misses a ton of really important problems. So we try to create feedback loops. Like, for example, when we put out new tools, we'll generally run a study on 40 random Americans and have them try the tool, give their critiques of it, tell us what they liked and disliked, and we'll use that to improve it. And then we'll generally run a second qualitative study where we'll have a bunch of our beta testers who are our real users try the tool and critique it. So we get tons of critiques that way that really help make our work better. And then when we put things out in the world, we get additional critiques. So critiques, awesome. Peer review, I think also can be good, but I don't think it's essential. Now, you might ask, well, why not just put it through peer review? Like, why not just do it? We would if it was really simple and easy process. The reality is it takes so much more time, like an almost unbelievably large extra amount of time to go through the process. And so it just on a cost benefit basis just doesn't make sense to us. And so our general policy right now is we sometimes do publish. As I mentioned, we've recently published 2 papers in peer-reviewed journals, but we generally will do it when we can find a good academic collaborator. So let's say we're working on a research study and we're like, oh, we know someone who might want to collaborate with us. We'll pull them into it. It'll be their job to write up the paper and submit it for peer review. Usually we'll do the bulk of the research, although with their input, with their ideas, which can be very helpful, but usually we'll do most of the actual execution. And so it's a great collaboration. So that's kind of something we've been moving towards to get the kind of best of both worlds, but still with most of our work, we don't do that.
Do you want to form a positive new habit? Are you interested in improving your diet, learning a skill, or getting fit with daily exercise? Then you should check out the free Clearer Thinking program called Daily Ritual, a Habit Creation System. Powered by over 2 years of research, the Daily Ritual program teaches simple techniques that can help you form a new, beneficial daily habit. If you're motivated to make a positive change to your daily routine, these techniques may be just the thing you need to lock in your new activity. Are you ready to reshape your day? To use the free Daily Ritual tool, or to find Clearer Thinking's other free tools and mini courses, head to clearerthinking.org. So on a different topic, one listener critiqued your view that AI companies should roll out AI text watermarking. Can you tell us a bit about what that watermarking is and why you think that these companies should roll it out?
Right. So text watermarking is when you have an LLM AI that generates text, you might want to know, was it generated by an AI or was it not? And that what the text watermarking does, essentially, during the generation process, it hides information in the text that makes it much more reliable to tell whether it was generated by an AI.
So one of the critiques around this, of your views, is that maybe companies didn't roll this out because it's just not technically feasible. Not that they're being negligent or not that they're focusing on other things, but just that maybe there's not a way to do this reliably. Is that the case?
Yeah, and so to steel man their view for a moment, I will say that with any kind of watermarking technology, there typically will be counter technology that helps you remove the watermark. And I wouldn't expect this to be any different, right? Like if someone is really, really intent on removing a watermark, they could probably do it. And eventually some software will spring up that helps you do it more automatically if there's demand to remove it. Additionally, there may be ways to get around it. Like maybe you can have another AI rewrite it in slightly different words, and maybe that removes the watermark, right? Or maybe if some of the companies deploy the watermarking technology, but not others, then people will just move to the ones that don't watermark, right? So I think that, to me, that's kind of the steelman perspective of what this person is saying. What I will say is that I was told by someone who was involved that at least one of these companies actually has a technology that really works. And the approach is actually quite fascinating. You might think, well, how on earth can you generate just regular text in such a way that you can tell whether that particular AI generated it or not, right? It's just text. What could you possibly look at, right? With an image, at least you could say, well, maybe you can hide some details in the image, like some slight pixelation that the human eye can't detect that like indicates whether the image came from an AI or something. But, and indeed you can do that, but you might think, well, text, how on earth are you going to do that? All you have to work with is letters and words, and we're going to see all the words. There's nothing, you can't like put a hidden word in there, right? So the basic approach, at least for this technology, is that whenever it's generating the next token or the next word, it will slightly raise or lower the probability of some words being generated. Just to keep it simple, imagine like half of all the words in English are going to get a lowered probability and half of the words in all of English are going to get a higher probability for that next token. And then for the token after that, again, half the words in English will have a raised probability, half will have a lower probability, but it's a different set of words every time. And which set of words it is with each token is chosen in a really clever way so that you can then reverse engineer it and say, okay, was this set of words generated by this AI? Well, we can go back for each word and say, well, for token 3, we know what set of words it was that was supposed to have a lower probability. Did it generate that word or not? And in fact, this seems to be quite effective. So you can go back and by comparing which words or tokens appeared at which points and comparing it to the word lists of which words were lowered or increased in probability, you can actually get a very reliable signal without that much text of whether it came from that AI. Now, I think that AI companies should roll this out. I think it's bad when we can't tell what's generated by AI. I think, for example, a recent thing came out where it turned out people were using AI to generate lots of responses on Reddit. And I think this is a bad thing when AI can start appearing everywhere without us realizing it. Now, those Steelman views I mentioned, I do agree with those that yes, someone could get around the watermark if they really wanted to. Yes, someone could switch to another AI. But I think really the way to handle this is that each AI company, every large AI producer should roll this out. There aren't really that many of them. There's Google, there's OpenAI, there's Anthropic, there's Meta. If they all just collaborated, they could roll out this technology, or they could each roll out their own technology, and it could just make it much more reliable. And I think one of the reasons to do this is not just for like the sanity of people knowing what's AI and what's not, and potential abuses of AI, but it's also because massive cheating is now happening where lots of people are using AI for things and pretending it's their own work. You're seeing an enormous amount of this in schools, and it would be really nice if teachers had some way to reliably tell what's generated by AI, because right now they don't have very reliable ways. Or things like job applications that are entirely written by AI. And I'm not talking about people using these as like aids, where it's helping them brainstorm and things like that. I mean, when it's just someone puts in a prompt and then the entire text is AI, and then they just, spit it out as a result. And I think also the amount of friction matters. Like if all the major AI companies implement this kind of thing, it just becomes much more difficult. Even if it's not that difficult, you at least have to then think about it. You're like, if you really want to like cheat the system, you have to actually try to figure out a way around it. And then how do you know you really successfully figured out a way around it and it's not going to still get detected? So it just creates a barrier to using this stuff in an abusive way, which I think is important, because it's not like everyone has infinite intent to do bad things. It's like, no, many people will be deterred by like kind of small, chances of being caught. But if like there really is no chance of getting caught, then you're like, there's just very little deterrence.
Do we know, let's take the narrow domain of just education. Do we have any metrics on how prevalent this is? How frequently students are using AI to just sort of copy and paste answers?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any good studies on this or anything. But I mean, part of the problem is, how do you even know, right? Even if you had all the essays, literally, we don't have a good way to tell if they're AI. There are tools that claim they can do it, but what I've heard is that they're just not that accurate. Like that's my understanding. And I think it's a big part of that is because the AI companies don't provide really good tech to help you, right? They could, but they don't. And so companies try to make their own systems to detect it, and I just don't think they're that reliable. Anecdotally, I've heard of teachers being absolutely inundated with AI written essays, constant AI cheating, and a lot of sense of that they don't know what to do, right? Like, okay, maybe we just need to have students write essays in class, but like, how do you do that for your regular homework assignments, right? Other people saying, well, screw it, maybe we should just accept that they're going to use AI and just assume everything's written to AI. But then, okay, well, how do you teach critical thinking if someone could just outsource their thinking to the AI? So I think it's a really big problem, and I don't think there's good solutions right now.
Now, most of the technical bits of this are going to be way over my head, but one limitation that does occur to me is that the length of the text matters probably a lot for when you're trying to determine whether or not something was written by AI. For example, if a student gives a 3-word answer to a question, it's going to be very hard to tell whether that was written by an AI or not. Whereas if they give a 3-paragraph response, then it's much easier to, assuming we had these detection tools in place, it'd be much easier to detect a watermark on 3 paragraphs than on 3 words. Is that a potential limitation of this technology?
Absolutely. And that's definitely true. The shorter the text, the harder it is to detect. My understanding is that the best versions of this technology, they get exponentially more confident as the number of words increases. So, I don't know what that exponent is. It might depend on the technology, but like, suppose it gets, 5% more confident with every word or whatever it is, that like, because it's exponential, it goes pretty fast. So as you get to longer and longer blocks, it can get a very high degree of certainty.
You write a lot about critiquing yourself, taking real stock of how you think about things and how you can think better about things. And one person wrote that they're concerned that, the smartest people already tend to doubt themselves the most. Wouldn't we do better to err on the side of encouraging, scientists, rationalists, really smart people to speak up rather than contributing to a culture of excessive hesitation? Because it does seem like the loudest people in the world right now are also the ones who are most confident about things that they are probably clearly wrong about.
Yeah, it reminds me of a Yeats quote, which is that the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And I think there's definitely something to this, right? That the people that know the most, you want them speaking out. You don't want them doubting themselves too much, right? And excessive questioning is not necessarily healthy, and it may lead people not to take action in the world or not to express their viewpoints. So I think that's a fair point. However, what I will say is I think that there's a bit of an assumption baked in there, which is that looking to improve, questioning yourself, becoming aware of your mistakes and trying to work on them. I think there's an assumption that those activities mean that you shouldn't be contributing to the world, you shouldn't be speaking out, you shouldn't be offering what you know, right? And I think that's not true. I don't think those things are incompatible at all. I think if you take the view that to make any mistake is a huge problem, or to have a chance that you're wrong is a huge problem, then yeah, the implication would be don't speak out, don't contribute. But I don't think that's the case. I think that making mistakes is just a human thing. It's a thing we all do. Being wrong sometimes is a human thing. We all are wrong sometimes. Those are not good reasons not to try to do things, not to contribute. And so what I would say is we want both. We want self-questioning. We want people to acknowledge their mistakes, try to understand mistakes they've made, try to improve based on them, but also not let them hold them back from doing things in the world. If you wait until you're perfect to do things, well, then you'll be waiting forever. And if you put a lot of ideas out in the world, you'll be wrong sometimes. And that's just something you have to accept, and that's okay.
How do you think about decision making when it comes to the probability that you're right about something? For example, let's say I was a policymaker, and when I'm young and naive, I believe 100% that some economic theory is right. And so I base all my policies around this. But as I grow and learn and read more and understand the world better, I come to conclude that, I guess I adjust my probabilities to say, well, maybe like I'm 75% sure that this theory is right, but now I have some doubts or concerns. And, it's not as though I can write policies such that 75% of the economy is this one economic theory and the other 25% is something else. These decisions collapse into binaries, like either I implement this or I don't, or I implement something else or I don't. And how do you think about converting those uncertainties into decisions?
Well, I think for most decisions, when there's not a lot at stake, like not a super high risk or a ton of stuff is being put on the line, you should just try to maximize expected value given the probabilities. And you can prove mathematically that if you have a fixed good that you're optimizing for, like let's say in the situation, you're just interested in money because, it's a money decision or something like that. And that's the only thing on the line. And the risk is not that big. You're not risking most of your savings. You're just risking a small amount of your money. Then you can show that, in fact, the expected value is the optimal strategy. It will dominate all other strategies in the long term, on average. It doesn't mean it does every single time, but on average, it will dominate all other strategies in the long term. So I think we have a nice, clear answer to that. Now, if you're making big risks or there's a lot at stake, you have to also take into account risk, such as risk of ruin, right? And that you have to think of that separately as well. But I will also say that I think a lot of things that seem binary are not necessarily binary. Like, yes, if you have to vote and there's like two options in front of you, yeah, you just vote. You're just going to vote for the one that you think is better. So that's not incompatible with being uncertain, because you could just say, well, given the in an expected value sense, I think this option is better, so you're going to vote for it. But many things that seem binary are not. Like, let's say you're a politician and there's a policy. Well, maybe you can influence the implementation of the policy. Maybe if you're only 75% sure it's going to work, you could build some things into the policy that help in the case that it's wrong. Or you could build in some monitoring to tell if it's not working, etc. So I think there are often other options.
So on Facebook, you made some claims about how people might interpret a hand gesture that Elon Musk made on stage at the inauguration. And some people had some feedback and critiques in that thread. Can you summarize for us what the thread was about?
Okay, so I said in the comment that I thought that few people, if they independently came across the video of Musk, they'd never heard anything about it. They'd never heard anyone say that it might be a Nazi salute. Watching it, they would independently think on their own, that's a Nazi salute. So that was my claim. I wasn't talking about whether I thought it was a Nazi salute. I was simply saying my perception of what other people would think if they watched it with no prior priming. And someone very strongly disagreed with me, to the point where they made a bet with me about it. They said, hey, I'll bet you you're wrong. And not only will I bet you're wrong, but they offered me 10 to 1 odds. So in other words, I would have to pay $10 if I lost against their $100 they'd have to pay me if I won. So I was like, sure, I'll take the bet. And the way we decided to operationalize the bet is that I would run a little study. I would recruit people who had never heard about this video before. They would watch it, and then they'd be asked about what they saw happen in the video. And if they on their own independently mentioned it was a Nazi salute, we would count up how often that happened. if at least, so we're going to test on 25 people, and if at least 8 out of those 25, that means at least 32% of them independently mentioned that it was a Nazi salute, they would win the money, the $10 of mine, and otherwise I would win the $100 of theirs. So I won the bet. It turned out that only somewhere between 4 and 7 of the respondents said that it was a Nazi salute independently. The number, whether it's 4 or 7, depends exactly on how you count what they wrote. Are you more lenient or more conservative in counting it? But anyway, so that was what happened. But some people, I guess, strongly disagreed with me and critiqued me in different ways.
Mm-hmm. So one critique was that this is only 25 participants. That's hardly enough to run a robust study on. What's your thought about that?
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, I think with only 25 participants, it's hard to generalize it to the whole world. But basically, it was in terms of a bet. It wasn't designed to be some really rigorous study. It was more like, hey, I'll bet you're wrong, and I'm really confident. And I was like, okay, and let's say that's the term we agreed on. It was actually such a big news story. It was actually pretty hard to even recruit people that hadn't heard of it. And so that was also part of why it wasn't that many people we tested it. But I think, so if you find there's 4 to 7 out of 25, we don't know what the number would be if we tested, 1,000 people. But it would be pretty surprising if, 70% of people responded this way, if only between 4 and 7 out of our 25 did.
And how exactly did you filter out people who had already seen or heard of the video?
So we screened people. We only included them if they said they had not heard any news about Elon Musk in the past 2 weeks, because it had occurred within 2 weeks. So if they hadn't heard Elon Musk news in the past 2 weeks, we knew that they hadn't heard about the video, because we didn't want to ask them about the video because we were worried that would prime them as well.
So another critique is that the gesture for many people is clearly a Nazi salute, and the question of whether naive viewers label it as such is sort of beside the point. It's like asking whether a 5-year-old child labels it as a Nazi salute. It doesn't really matter. Like, they don't know what a Nazi salute is anyway, so what does their opinion matter?
If I try to steal them on this, maybe the view is, well, what do we really learn from this? Maybe a lot of people don't even know what a Nazi salute looks like. So it could just be that, like, if people don't know what a Nazi salute looks like, then thinking it's not a Nazi salute or not indicating it's a Nazi salute may mean nothing. And I agree with that. Some people don't know what one looks like, and certainly if they don't know what one looks like, then they wouldn't identify it as one. Basically, I think it's a reasonable point, but I don't think it really has much to do with my post, because my post is not about whether it's a Nazi salute. And I know it's funny, it's like hard to talk about a thing when you're actually talking about just one aspect of it, but people want to drag in other aspects. So the post is not about whether it's a Nazi salute, it's about whether random people will think it's a Nazi salute who hadn't heard about it. Right? And yet people want to make it about whether it's a Nazi salute. And I understand that impulse, right? But that's not really what it was about.
Do you think, though, like, there's a possibility that you could have overscreened, like, by asking people whether they'd heard any Musk news in the past 2 weeks, when Musk is in the news every single day, every hour of every day, is like selecting the most media illiterate people, to put it frankly?
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point. Like, maybe the people who hadn't heard about Musk's news in the last 2 weeks are less likely to recognize a Nazi salute. Maybe they're less likely to know about history, etc. And I will say, I was really surprised how hard it was to find people that said they had not heard any Musk news in the last 2 weeks. Like, we had to screen tons of people to find 25. So, I mean, I guess just Musk was so in the news that, like, anyone, it's like it was hard to even not hear about him in some way or another, right? That being said, I don't know that that's true. I'm not confident at all that that's true. Like, a lot of people know what a Nazi salute is. Like, it's in tons of movies. It's one of the most important, historical events in, our grandparents' lifetimes. So I think most people have probably seen it, at least in some form of media at some point. Probably most people have seen it quite a number of times in media at some point. But yeah, it could be the case that people who don't read the news much or don't follow the news much are less likely to have seen it.
And one final critique about this was just the overall framing, like treating this as an interesting experiment sort of detracts from the moral and historical gravity of the whole problem of Nazism and the symbolism used. What's your thought about that framing device?
On the object level question of was it really a Nazi salute, I would say that the evidence that I brought from my study was only very slight evidence against it being a Nazi salute, because whether, what percentage of people interpret it that way on their own, I don't think is a super strong indicator of whether he intended to make a Nazi salute or not. So I just don't think that little study I ran has much bearing on that question of did he intend to give a Nazi salute. Although I can see why people wanted to make it about that.
Feel free to not answer this question if you don't want to, but are you willing to share with us your own views about whether or not it was a Nazi salute?
I feel pretty uncertain whether he intended. I think the question of whether it was, there's different ways to answer that question. Like one way to answer that question is to answer it saying, well, was it the same physical motion as a Nazi salute? And there you can just compare it to Nazi salutes and you can say, there are some Nazi salutes that actually are very, very similar to the physical motion he did. So in that sense, yes, it is technically a version of a Nazi salute. The other question you might ask, though, is did he intend to do a Nazi salute? Was he thinking, I'm going to do a Nazi salute, and then he did one? Or was it just an accidental hand gesture that happened to resemble a Nazi salute? That's a question we can't really know. I mean, without getting inside his mind, you can't know for sure. However, you can look at evidence, and there are different pieces of evidence. Like one piece of evidence is that he supported a right-wing party in Germany. So that's some evidence. Another thing is that he's known to do things to troll other people. So that's another piece of evidence. He's even tweeted about how he likes to troll people. So that's another piece of evidence. Because you could imagine doing a Nazi salute because he believes in Nazism. But you could also imagine doing a Nazi salute just to troll people, even though he doesn't believe in Nazism, right? Either of those could be true. There's also evidence against it being a Nazi salute. One piece of evidence is that very, very few people actually believe in Nazism. Like even most far-right people don't believe in it. They think it's a stupid or hateful or horrible ideology, right? So it's like actually an extremely unpopular ideology in the world. So like that does lower the probability that he believes in it. So yeah, I think there's evidence on both sides. I think we have to be pretty uncertain. At least I don't have enough evidence to be confident one way or the other.
So another criticism of your work, and I think this probably applies to some of the things you've said on the podcast and some of the things that you've created through Sparkwave, is that you often coin or popularize terms for concepts that already exist. Like, for example, importance hacking. Is that not just another word for hype? Is that, isn't that already a known thing? Why come up with a new word for this or a new phrase for this? And maybe the claim is like you're sort of reinventing wheels that don't need to be reinvented, or just repackaging things that are already known. So we also sticked an AI on some of your blog posts and writings to see how it would critique you. And one of the critiques it made is that you often coin new terms like importance hacking or light gassing, things like this that are maybe just repackagings of known concepts. What's your take on that critique?
Yeah, so to steel man the AI for a second, I do sometimes try to coin terms. And sometimes those terms I coin, there are other words or phrases that have a related meaning, right? Like they're not completely novel, like nobody's ever thought the concept before. And so you might argue, well, I should just stick with like a common phrase, or I should, whatever the closest phrase in English for what I mean, and don't come up with a new word, just use a phrase to describe it, right? Or pick the closest word in English, even if there's no word that's that close, pick the closest one instead, right? I actually pretty strongly disagree with this critique. I would definitely agree if there was really a word that really captured the meaning, then I would say, yeah, just use that word, of course. Then I would completely agree with the critique. However, generally speaking, when I try to coin words, I try to coin it in situations where I don't think there's an adequate word that already exists. And while, yes, you could explain the concept in a bunch of words, that it really would require a bunch of words. So, and I think it's valuable having a single word for things when you want to be able to think about them and converse about them fluently. Like, for example, imagine there was no word for derivative in calculus. You just, every single time you were talking about derivative, you had to explain what you meant. Like, it would be so cumbersome to talk about calculus. It'd be so cumbersome even to think about calculus. So by packing it all into one word, it just makes it much more fluid to work with and think with and communicate. And also just to reason with, right? So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give words to things when I think it's useful to compress information into a single word so we could talk about it more fluidly. We can think about it more fluidly. And also, hopefully, to help enable people to talk about the concept. Because now they have a word to refer to it by. Okay, so let's use those two examples that the AI gave. One is importance hacking. Importance hacking, just to kind of define terms here, it's the name that we gave with our project Transparent Replications to a strategy that some people use to get published in academic journals. And basically, the strategy of importance hacking is to try to make your study seem like it was valuable or novel or interesting enough to deserve to be published when it's not. And specifically, We mean it as a strategy to get published, much the way that p-hacking is a strategy to get published. In p-hacking, you use fishy statistics or throw away outliers or check lots of outcomes so as to make it look like a result has a p less than 0.05, so that statistical significance, so that you can get it published. Whereas importance hacking is not about changing the statistical result, because with importance hacking, your result probably would replicate. Like if you redid the study, you'd get the same answer. It's about misleading reviewers about the nature of your result. So they misunderstand the nature of it and they think it's worthy of publication when it's not. Okay, so that's importance hacking. And now look at how many words it took me to explain that. Like it's actually not that easy to explain. It takes quite a few words to explain it well. I don't even know if I did that good a job, but we're packaging into one word, right? So I think that's pretty powerful. But why this word? Why bother having a word for it? Well, just like p-hacking, imagine trying to explain p-hacking before there was a word. P-hacking captures something really important about the way science often fails. It is talking about something that's happening that's corrupting science. Just like with p-hacking, importance hacking we introduced for exactly the same reason. We think that this is a big problem that's occurring in science. We think it's making the academic literature significantly worse. And so we want to introduce a term that points out this exact problem. Now, you could say, well, why don't you just use a related word like hype? Because hype is a word that everyone knows. And there is a sense in which importance hacking is a form of hype. The thing about it, though, is it's so much more specific than hype. Yes, it's a form of hype, but hype refers to all kinds of things. We wanted to call out this very specific behavior. It's a specific strategy people use to get published when a result really shouldn't be published. So that's kind of my response.
So another critique that an AI made is that your work, especially with the research you do that backs like clear thinking's tools and things like that, relies too much on self-report.
Yeah, Literal Banana, who's I've had on our podcast a couple times, also has made this critique, not necessarily about my work, but about self-report broadly, and probably about my work too, if I were to ask Literal Banana. So to steelman this view, self-report can be very unreliable. There's a lot of reasons for that. Let's go through some of the reasons it can be unreliable. So the first reason it can be unreliable is that people sometimes have an incentive to lie. Like if you ask someone a question and it's about something really embarrassing, they may not want to tell you and they might lie. And I think this is a really big problem, especially if like you're interviewing someone in person about something and it's a sensitive topic, or it's about something illegal or something someone might be embarrassed about, etc. Okay. A second reason self-report can be unreliable is because people are not actually trying to give you a real answer. Maybe they're just clicking as fast as possible. Maybe they're just fucking with you and trying to corrupt your survey data. Maybe there's, an AI bot that's like trying to just take money out of, the system if you're paying for a survey, right? So that's the second reason. A third reason that self-report can be unreliable is because people actually are not able to provide that information. And this can actually come in different forms. One form is that sometimes people don't remember things. For example, if you ask people, how many times did you do such and such over the last year? They may literally just give you a bad answer because they don't remember or they can't give a good estimate because of limitations of memory. Another reason people can have limited ability to answer something is that they just don't have an accurate self-view, right? Like, for example, if you ask people about their positive qualities, people tend to give exaggeratedly positive answers about their positive qualities, even in situations where there's no incentive to lie. And I think this is because due to the way the human ego works, we kind of have an internal thing going on where we tend to see ourselves on average as more positive than we really are. I don't think everyone does this. I think, for example, depressed people can do the opposite. But I think on average, people tend to do this. And so this limits ability to report accurately. There's also things that are subconscious processes that we have trouble accurately reporting on because they happen subconsciously. Okay, so those are all, I think, valid points. And it is also true that we do a bunch of work with self-report. Not all of our work is like that, but a bunch of our work is like that. Okay, so what do I think, all things considered? I think self-report really does have all these issues, but first of all, there are smart strategies to get around a lot of the issues. And second of all, the issues don't always apply. So how do you get around people having incentive to lie? Well, you don't give them incentive to lie. If you're asking about sensitive subjects, you're going to use anonymous reporting. You don't have it be someone asking them because they're going to then have social biases come into play. And you got to really assure them it's anonymous. There's no way to trace it back to them. And I'm not going to say that eliminates all lying, but I think it vastly eliminates lying. And just to give you a data point on this, in one survey that was anonymous, we asked people about have they ever cheated on a romantic partner in their life? And more than 20% of people said yes. So that's like a lot of people saying yes to something that's very sensitive. So yeah, I think a lot of people are honest in those situations, even about sensitive material. Another thing is you have to be really mindful of what people are able to report on, what they're not. So we try to avoid asking people to report on things that we don't think they're capable of reporting on, either because they're subconscious processes or because they're unlikely to remember them. And then on the other point, that people tend to have biases in their reporting, like they might think they're better than they are things. We just try to take that into account in terms of the meaning of those self-reports. So if we do have people self-report on something like, oh, how rational do you believe yourself to be? We're not going to treat that as how rational they actually are. In other words, we know that what we're actually measuring is how rational people report themselves to be. And we're not going to try to mistake that with thinking that's the actual true measure of rationality, which is definitely not. And we have actually studied that exact kind of question, and we know it's not a good measure of rationality. So self-report can really just be a powerful and useful tool. And perhaps surprisingly to many, in many cases, it's literally the best tool there is. You might think, well, can't we use some cool measuring device? But it turns out a lot of times there is no cool measuring device that measures the thing accurately. And even if there were, it would be ridiculously expensive and it would be almost impossible to run large studies with it in a reliable way. So take, for example, how happy people feel. There just is no measuring device that's better than asking people a bunch of questions about how happy they feel. So, maybe one day there will be, but until that day, I think we're stuck with self-report for a lot of things. The last thing I will add is we've also tested our self-report a lot, and we find that actually it does quite a good job for a lot of things. Like we show that we can predict some objective things from self-report. We can show that we can predict some self-report things from other self-report things that are seemingly unrelated and so on. So we do see that there's quite a bit of signal there in self-report.
Another critique given by an AI about clear thinking's tools is that they don't sufficiently account for individual differences. Like a tool might be effective for an average user or typical user, but might fall down at edge cases or cases where people vary significantly, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so to steelman the AI's view, different people are different. A tool that helps one person may not help someone, or might even be a little bit harmful to someone else. A tool is not necessarily going to be able to meet people where they're at or adapt to their situations. And that's all true. What I would say is that the main thing we try to optimize is helping people on average, right? If we put something out in the world and it creates an average benefit, I think we've done a good job. Of course, we also don't want to harm people, and we definitely will try to avoid things that we think are going to harm people for sure. But the main thing that we are optimizing for is average benefit. So I don't think it is really a critique that cuts to the heart of what we're doing. It's certainly true that by adapting to the individual, you can sometimes do better. But it's actually surprisingly hard to do that in the sense that even sort of the best things that have been developed in many domains, all you could say about them is that they work on average, right? Like there's still people that don't respond to them. There's still people, maybe even some people that get a slight negative effect. Like the best medical treatments, they usually don't work for every single person, even though they're really effective, right? The best psychotherapies that have ever been created, they're most effective ones in the world for specific disorders. They still don't help everyone. And they might even make some people slightly worse. So I think it's just very, very hard to ever avoid that critique. Of course, you could try to make things more adaptive, but often it's really difficult to do so because it's actually often very hard to even find things that work on average well, so you kind of spend all your optimization time focusing on that, and then to make it like a bit better by adapting to the individual might take like 10 times even longer than that. So it's not necessarily always a good use of time to even investigate that, and many such attempts fail to make things be better. Like if you try to make things super adaptive, I think most such attempts fail to actually beat just trying to do a good job on average for the bulk of people.
Do people of different genders actually have different personalities? We've all heard that men are from Mars and women are from Venus, but we've also heard that men and women are actually no different from each other at their core. Clearly, both of these perspectives can't be right. Is one of them accurate, or are they both just sensationalized nonsense? To try to answer these questions, the team at clearerthinking.org analyzed enormous amounts of data, ran 15 separate studies, and have now published their results in the form of a free, data-driven test called the Gender Continuum Test. You can take this fun test to learn about the relationship between gender and personality based on data from more than 15,000 people. And you'll probably learn some things about yourself in the process too, since it'll provide a personalized analysis of your personality. To take the Gender Continuum Test, or to find Clearer Thinking's other free tools and mini courses, visit clearerthinking.org.
Josh, do you have any critiques of me or our work that you want to bring up?
So you've talked a lot about intrinsic values and valuism, and my understanding of valuism is the idea that basically, as a life strategy, you're trying to bring more of your intrinsic values into the world. Feel free to correct me on that if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding of it.
No, that's right. Yeah, I think of it as having two parts. One, try to figure out what you intrinsically value, and two, try to take effective actions to create what you intrinsically value.
Okay, so I think my question about this is sort of two part. Like, one is this a normative claim about morality? Like, this is what people should do, is try to bring more of their intrinsic values into the world? And if so, how does that work in the cases where a person might value something that's very harmful? Like maybe they get real pleasure out of harming or killing other people.
Well, so valuism, I do not propose as a normative system. So it's not saying you should do it. It's just saying, here's a life philosophy. I'm putting it out there. If you're looking for a life philosophy, for example, let's say you fell out of religion, you no longer believe it, and you're like, well, what do I believe? What should I do to guide my life? Or let's say you don't believe in objective moral truth, and so but you feel like, I wish I had a framework to think about what I'm doing in my life, but there don't seem to be objective answers to that. What do I do? I'm putting it out there as a potential life philosophy to consider, which I think it's a life philosophy I find valuable, and I think other people will find it valuable too, but not everyone. So, but that being said, I don't think that fully gets around. I think that partially addresses your critique, but I don't think it fully gets around your critique. Because to steelman your critique, I think you're saying, well, if you're saying figure out your intrinsic values and pursue them, well, maybe some people's intrinsic values are like to cause harm or create suffering or chaos, and maybe in the pursuit of those, their intrinsic values, they'll create harm, even if their intrinsic values are not harmful. Does that accurately describe it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing that I found really fascinating, we attempted to kind of discover the different types of intrinsic values out there. And as part of that, we asked people to submit their intrinsic values. And we got, I think it was like literally thousands of submissions of people's claimed intrinsic values. And we kind of went through them and categorized them and deduplicated them. And we also looked at, different perspectives on intrinsic values from others as well. And from this, we created 22 categories of intrinsic values. And one thing that was really interesting to me is we didn't see much evidence at all that people have intrinsic values that are inherently harmful. In other words, like we didn't really see evidence that like some people's intrinsic value is just to create suffering or just to create chaos or something like that. And I think that is pretty nice. Like you could imagine a world where people do have an intrinsic value like that. I don't think we live in that world. And I'm not going to say that like there literally are zero people like that, but if they exist, I think they're incredibly rare, which is really good. So I think no intrinsic values that I'm aware of are bad in and of themselves. And so they're, in that sense, they're kind of okay, at least okay. And many of them are actually actively good, not just okay, in the sense that they're things like forging connections with others and reducing suffering and increasing happiness, et cetera. They're things that almost everyone would agree are good. That being said, it still could be that someone in the pursuit of their intrinsic values do create harm in the world. Now, I do think every life philosophy, no matter what, has a danger of this. So I don't think any life philosophy is immune from, well, what if someone does harm in pursuit of that life philosophy? It could always happen. I think one thing that helps this with valuism in particular is that most people actually have at least some intrinsic values around not causing harm to others, not causing suffering. And so that kind of helps rein people in to some extent in the pursuit of their intrinsic values to like, they actually actively don't want to harm other people. There are some people who probably lack these intrinsic values, like they just don't have one around. It's not that they actively intrinsically value creating harm, but maybe they lack an intrinsic value of preventing harm. And in that case, I think they're at greater risk. And so that I think those people would be, could be more likely to create harm in the pursuit of their intrinsic values, even if their intrinsic values are not bad themselves. The other thing I'll say is that according to my own life philosophy, I would oppose someone who, in the pursuit of their intrinsic values, created a lot of harm because I value a lack of harm or a reduction of harm. So in other words, it's not to say that everyone who pursues their intrinsic values are going to all have compatible like efforts in the world, and some of them might oppose others of them. And I think that's just natural. Like if someone's creating a lot of harm by following their intrinsic values, well, it still works against what I intrinsically value. And so I would oppose their actions, if that makes sense.
So you had a blog post about whether magic is real or not, and apparently there were a lot of critiques about this. So maybe the first place to start there is for you to summarize that post for us, and then we can look at the critiques of the post.
Yeah, so before we get into the critiques, of which there were multiple, let me try to express briefly what I was trying to say in that essay. Basically, the argument is that there is a sense in which magic exists, but it does not exist in the real physical world. And here, I'm not talking about magic as like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or even Wicca magic. I'm talking about situations where we view things as having a property and the actual property is psychological, but we think of it as being more than psychological, like either as existing physically in the world or having non-psychological properties. And so it's a little bit abstract, a little bit hard to understand when I describe it that way, but I think it's a little bit easier if I give some examples. So, for instance, dead bodies. After a person has died, many people perceive the dead body as not merely symbolizing the living person, but still being the living person in ways that I think don't correspond to physical reality. Or another example would be sex. Many people view things involving sex as carrying sort of special transformative properties. And while that may be true psychologically, I think people view it as though it's something more than psychological. So an example would be that people put tremendous amount of weight on virginity. And in some cultures, no longer being a virgin could be considered incredibly bad, maybe even banish-worthy in certain contexts. But people view it as something, it's not just like the person was changed psychologically. It's like somehow they were fundamentally changed by losing their virginity, right? And I think there are a bunch of other examples of this. I'll give one more. If it was something like body energy healing, where someone holds their hands over another person without touching that person, and the person might feel like they were healed. I mean, I don't believe that they're actually being healed through that process. I do believe it can create psychological effects. Like the person might feel something, they might have an experience, but I think it's a psychological experience, whereas some people would say, no, there's something else, a non-psychological experience occurring, some physical experience, some magical experience. And so I think there are a bunch of cases like this where we view things as being magical and we impart non-psychological properties into what are actually psychological phenomena. And so then to wrap up, the point of the essay is that it's not that these things don't exist. They do exist, but they exist in our simulation of reality that our brains create. And so the analogy I make is to virtual reality. So in virtual reality, suppose there are zombies running around. Well, there's a sense in which those zombies really exist, but they exist in the virtual reality. They don't exist in the actual physical world. And the way that we experience reality is not by experiencing things directly. You can't actually see a photon of light. What you see is the experience of, let's say, redness that the red photon creates when it hits your eye, and then it creates an electrical signal that goes into your brain. So you're seeing the experience of red. And so redness exists, but it exists in your simulation of reality. And I'm saying that these sorts of magic exist, but they exist in our psychological experience of reality. It's not that the person laying their hands over someone actually healed them. It's that they created a psychological experience for that person.
So one of the main critiques is that you did this redefinition of magic, where most people have this definition that corresponds to something supernatural or ritualistic, and you have redefined it to be something psychological. And in doing so, there's sort of two side effects that have occurred. One is that you're sort of, in a way, no longer contending with the definitions that people normally use. And the other is that you are potentially ruling out real things that have occurred in the physical world that are measurable, but that we don't yet understand scientifically, even though people have labeled them as being magical.
Right. So just to make sure I understand those critiques, and I'll kind of try to steel man them. The first aspect of that is that, well, I'm kind of redefining the term magic, because what I'm calling magic isn't really magic the way it's broadly used. I would agree with that. I did try in the essay to explain what I meant by magic, but I think I could have done a better job of really clarifying. And you might say, well, maybe I shouldn't have named it magic. Maybe I should have said something else. But then I didn't know what else to call it. And if I call it something else, then people may not know what I'm talking about. So I think it's a bit tricky, but I do kind of agree with that critique that what I'm referring to doesn't refer to all of magic. And I could have done a better job of explaining that and exactly what I meant, and kind of ruling out the kinds of magic I don't mean. And then I think the other critique is basically like, well, maybe some of this stuff actually does have a non-psychological presence, or it's doing something that's beyond the psychological, and I'm kind of ruling that out. And that I think is a fair point. It's I'm I'm making a choice there and saying, yeah, I don't think those things are real. But for someone who does think they're real, then yeah, absolutely, it's a very fair critique. But that's just, my opinion is they're not real. My piece does kind of hinge on my belief that those are not real, because if they were real, then the critique wouldn't follow. Although that being said, the point could still stand about other things. Like maybe you agree that a dead body doesn't actually carry the properties of the living person anymore, most of the interesting properties of the living person, but you disagree about Reiki. Fine, that's no problem. But then you would just say my essay maybe applies to the things that you agree that are purely psychological.
So one analogy that I think you used in your blog post is about redness and how it's a perceptual phenomenon that occurs inside our brains. If we had a different kind of brain or a different kind of eye, then redness would be a different phenomenon, or maybe we wouldn't see red at all. And you compared this to magic and the idea that magic is something that happens inside a person's brain rather than out in the real world. One of the critiques of this is that magic has a sort of meaningful element or purposeful element to it, intentional element to it, that's not the same as redness. So there seems to be a significant distinction there, and perhaps using redness is not a good analogy, is the critique.
Yeah, I agree with that in the sense that I think it's a far from perfect analogy, because indeed the way we experience magic, as I'm calling it, is quite different than the way we experience redness. And what I was hoping to do in that analogy is just to point out how there's this people generally think of something like existing or not existing. And I'm trying to draw a distinction there, that there's let's talk about another category. So there's existing, like in the physical world, like atoms. There's not existing, like totally made up. And then there's this other category. And that's what I'm trying to use redness to get across what that other category is, which is it's things that exist in our minds, but they aren't out there physically in the world. And so redness is an example of that, even though it's not a perfect analogy to magic.
Another potential critique is that the stance you're taking here is very physicalist, very materialist. I don't know if you say it explicitly, but sort of ruling out anything supernatural. But it also neglects what are potentially broader perspectives on what consciousness is, like panpsychism, because panpsychism might be the kind of view that could account for more mystical or numinous experiences.
Right. So panpsychism is a view that says that maybe everything is conscious. Maybe consciousness is everywhere. And I think there's a variety of kind of related views. Like one view says everything is conscious. Maybe like atom is conscious too. Another view says maybe consciousness is like actually the fundamental thing. Maybe the physical material world is secondary, and it's like actually consciousness generates everything. And there's kind of other views around that. And I agree with the critique in the sense that it's true that if, for example, consciousness was fundamental and the material world didn't actually exist, the material world, for example, only exists insofar as like people imagine it or something like that, or consciousness generates it or something like that, then I think that would really change the paradigm of like what is magic, what could it be, what's possible. So I don't believe in that paradigm, but I do think that is a valid critique in the sense that if that paradigm were to hold, it would change the nature of magic a lot and how you might interpret it.
One final critique comes from a reader of the One Helpful Idea newsletter. They said they were reading through this particular newsletter. They saw an image. The image had a picture of 10 people in a boardroom, and there were 7 or 8 men and only 2 women. And they were saying, this is an AI generated image, so surely you could control what things were in the image. Why were there so many men compared to so few women? And is this not a problematic way to generate content?
Yeah, so if I understand their critique, to steelman it, I would say, yeah, so if putting out representations of boardrooms where there's only 2 women and 8 men, it might reinforce stereotypes against women, that women are not suited for business or not suited for positions of power. And these are stereotypes that are harmful, have been around for a long time. And it's good to kind of try to seek gender equality and not spread stereotypes. Do you think that's a fair steelmanning of it?
Yeah.
Yeah. My response is a fewfold. First of all, I will say that I think that there are certainly times when we might accidentally support stereotypes, and in doing so, we might be contributing to problems, and I think that we should try to avoid that. Now, do I think that we were doing that in this case? So a kind of funny thing about this example is actually, I believe it was a newsletter about how groups can be biased. And I think it actually, therefore, like the lack of representation, the image actually kind of worked synergistically with the idea in the newsletter to kind of reflect that. And so I don't think it was necessarily inappropriate for the context of we're talking about how groups can be biased, right? The second thing is that suppose that a group is writing many newsletters, and in a bunch of those newsletters, they're talking about people in positions of power, and half the time in the images, they have more men than women, and half the time they have more women than men. Would it be fair then to go and critique them every time they have more men than women to say that's you're representing a bias? I think kind of not in that case because, well, unless you're going to perfectly make it 50-50 each time, it seems a little bit unfair given that they're actually balancing it out, right? So I think it's my point I'm making there is just, it's a bit hard from any one example to say that it's biased because you kind of have to look at the sort of larger picture. And anytime there's an unequal number, I don't think that automatically means it's biased. Tell you another example where someone gave me a very similar critique. I had an essay and there were 3 examples given, and 2 of the examples used women in the example, and they were longer examples. And then there was only 1 example that used a man in the example, and it was a shorter example. And a person said that it was biased. Now, I don't think there's anything inherently biased about, having 2 women and 1 man. In fact, if you have only 3 examples, unless you're going to include like non-binary or other genders, well, you're going to have it be imbalanced. But I suspect what made them call me out on this in particular was the feeling that by the nature of the article, it could be associated with stereotypes of women, and therefore by using 2 women examples and 1 man example, maybe it was reinforcing that stereotype. Overall, I think these are critiques that are worth keeping in mind. Like I do think we should try to avoid reinforcing unfair stereotypes. I think that's a worthy goal. That being said, I also think it's pretty harsh if you're a writer who writes a lot and you sometimes use examples of men, sometimes examples of women. I think asking that every single one should be perfectly balanced. Like every image should have half men, half women. I think that's going too far. Or every essay should alternate men and women examples. I think it's going too far. So I think it's something that's like worth keeping in mind. We should be mindful of it. We should try not to reinforce stereotypes. But I also think we shouldn't be obsessive about like exactly perfectly gender balancing every single essay, every single image. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that all makes sense. I think probably it matters to how the image is being used, like whether you're referencing it or versus like endorsing it.
Right, because sometimes you want to show something that is the way that people see it.
Exactly.
Right, or is the most common thing, right? So it is true that CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are less likely to be women. And if you were depicting CEOs, would you want to gender balance it, even though that's not the way it is in the real world, or you want to depict it as it is, right? So it gets a little tricky saying like, what is reinforcing a stereotype versus what is representing the way things are, even if that's a bad way that things are.
How much effort do you think should be put into, let's say you go to ChatGPT and say, please generate an image of 10 people in a boardroom for me, and it generates this image of 8 men and 2 women. Like, clearly this is probably something it's learned from its training data, that this is the way things are on average likely to be or something like that. And so how much effort would you likely put in to say, well, actually, I'd prefer to have a more even balance of men and women or something like that in the image?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the effort really should just depend on sort of the level of harm that you anticipate, right? If you think in this particular instance, you're trying to, let's suppose it was an article about gender bias among CEOs where women are woefully underrepresented. You might purposely choose an image that has fewer women to illustrate your point, right? Like, so, I think it's very context dependent. How much harm it causes is very context dependent. And I think, you just want to be mindful of sort of like the level of anticipated harm.
But you would agree, I think, that AIs do have these kinds of biases because of the way they're trained, right?
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, Google got in hot water for trying to correct these biases, but overdoing it a bit. Like when people would ask for examples of Nazi soldiers, it would show Asian women, which we know that Asian women were not Nazi soldiers, right? And it was because they were trying to get the AI to be more, gender balanced and so on, but it kind of went too far and sometimes made these errors. Yes, I think that AI being trained on images in the internet, being trained on text in the internet, will tend to reflect the biases of the internet, which is the biases of people in general to a large extent, at least people who are internet users, unless we do something to try to correct that. And there are different approaches to try to correct that, right? There are many different approaches that AI companies have used. And I think some of them have made some progress. Some of them have gone too far and caused other problems. But yeah, you will often find biases in these AIs.
So as we wrap up, are there any critiques that have stuck with you over the years, maybe one that you had when you were younger or that is still very formative to your work today?
Yeah, one critique I got when I was in college, and then again got it later as an adult, is that sometimes people can't tell how much I like them. And this can actually be a problem, right? Like if I like someone, I want them to know that I like them. And I realize actually sometimes created insecurity in other people. Multiple people express that to me. And it's something I've tried to work on. And I try to work on it in a couple different ways. One is when I like someone, like really trying to communicate that to them, like as we get to know each other. Obviously it's not necessarily something you do if like you just met someone, but if you become friends, you want to communicate your feelings towards them and trying to be better at communicating like positive feelings towards others. Another is just, I tend to have not a very expressive face. And so just trying to, because of that, like compensate for that, like if I feel warmly, trying to express that in my face more, to express really I'm feeling, even if my face doesn't naturally always express it, and just kind of communicate that warmth in other ways. So I think that one was definitely a critique that was important for me to hear. Well, Josh, thanks so much. And thank you all for listening as well. If you have other critiques of me, send them to me, and then maybe we'll do another episode at some point of additional critiques. So you can just say you can just send me a critique, or you can just say you're submitting it for the episode in particular, that you'd be excited to have me respond to it. So yeah, Josh, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. Thanks again for listening. We always love to hear from our listeners, so if you have questions or comments for us, just send us an email at clearerthinkingpodcast@gmail.com. This episode was edited by Ryan Kessler and transcribed by We Amplify. Uri Bram is the podcast's factotum. If you like our show, then we'd really appreciate it if you could rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts and tell your friends about us on social media. We also hope you'll subscribe to our email newsletter called One Helpful Idea. Each week, we'll send you one idea that we think is really valuable that you can read about in just 30 seconds, along with that week's new podcast episodes, an essay by Spencer, and announcements about upcoming events. To sign up for that newsletter or to find show notes, transcripts, and more info about the show, visit podcast.clearerthinking.org. A listener asks, how can we best and most quickly tackle the climate crisis? What's the most effective thing for each of us to do as individuals?
In my view, there's only a few strategies for working on reducing man-made climate change that are realistic. And I think people often try really unrealistic strategies. So the three realistic strategies in my view, and by realistic, I just mean that they seem much more plausible that they could work, but I don't mean that they're easy, right? So the first is government collaboration. If major governments around the world took climate change really seriously, they could basically make a pact to do something about it. But it would essentially have to involve China, the US, India, and Europe. They have to all be involved. And then other countries obviously would be great if they were involved too. But without that, I think it's really, really tough. And of course, very few people have the power to make that happen. But by electing leaders that are interested in that, then that does increase the probability that that could happen. Leaders that are willing to create a kind of multi-country collaboration. The second thing that seems like a plausible strategy is better technology. I think so many organizations have tried get individuals to act against their own selfish interests to help the climate by getting individuals to try to pollute less and stuff like that. And I think those strategies just really, really don't work on average. And I think there's abundant evidence of that. But if technology improves, it may be in people's interests to reduce their greenhouse emissions. And when it's in people's interest to do that, I think they will do it. And so that is a second plausible strategy, is more investment in technology. What that could look like at the individual level, it could look like starting a company. It could look like joining a company that already exists, or playing around with new ideas for technology, learning about new technology, et cetera. And so I'm not an expert at all in this area, so I don't know exactly what technologies are needed, but I do know that there are a bunch of technologies that, if developed, could really help because they could shift it so that it's actually more in people's interests to pollute less. And also you can talk about carbon capture technology and the potential benefits of that. The third main strategy that seems plausible to me is increasing pressure on mega corporations, because there really aren't that many corporations that account for like a lot of the greenhouse gases. I think it's just a few hundred that account for like a surprisingly big proportion of it. And so if there was a way to influence those companies, for example, to get them to kind of agree with each other to do things differently, or investor pressure for the people that own their shares, perhaps that could actually move the needle and make a difference. And then finally, I'll just add, there are meta strategies. Meta strategies are things like getting other people interested in working on these existing strategies that might be promising, or creating more momentum towards those strategies. So that's what comes to mind. Obviously, it's hard to know what to do at an individual level, but if you really want to do something that's plausibly effective, I would urge you to think about those strategies and think about where your personal actions might fit into those. Of course, I might be wrong. There might be other strategies that are really great, but I'm pretty skeptical of all the other strategies that I've seen.